Hello, everybody. It's Gerry Scott here from Snowbird US Day Tracker. Today we have Kevyn Nightingale, and this is the first time that Kevin and I have actually. I've been a fan of his writings, and Kevin, I think you left M&P about 6 months ago, and you joined your new firm.
Not even that long. I'm at Levy Salis, which is a law firm based in Montreal, and I've been there for a whole 2.5 months.
Okay, well, all I know is that when you left, I got the notification through LinkedIn that Kevin had left and M&P, and he was entering a new chapter in his life. And I thought I better get a hold of this guy to find out what's going on. So, Kevin, welcome to our podcast, our show, our radio show, for those that still call them radio shows, like myself. So, tell me a little bit more about what you're doing. And then I've got some great questions for you. And this is very timely because I'm one of those guys that live in Vancouver, Canada. And every time I go to Maui, I'm saying, man, I got to exit Canada. They're making it harder to leave Canada, and they're making it harder to stay in Canada. So tell us more about your new gig. And
Well, I am now working for a law firm. And although I have a law degree, I am not a lawyer. And it is a cross-border law firm. So we deal with people moving back and forth, people who have cross-border tax issues, US citizens living in Canada, people who are expanding their business or buying a business cross-border, Canadians who are buying US real estate for personal use and also for their business or for rental. So we do basically all of the legal stuff, all the tax advisory stuff that helps people do things across the border.
well, like I say, this is going to be a lot of fun because this is on my mind every time. And I'm motivated with my wife. She says, listen, we're not taking the plane home. This is our home. So we're going to stay in Maui here. But I do love Vancouver with family and grandkids now. So anyhow, Kevin, if you're ready, I'm going to jump right into these questions, and I'm going to be a sponge. I'm going to, and I once again, I always tell people, this is not a do-it-yourself podcast. This is really connecting you with the right professionals. And Kevin, I'm excited to get your responses on these questions. So right out of the gate, are you seeing an increase in well-off Canadians moving to the United States?
There has been a tremendous increase in people moving to the US, and as you just said, wanting to move to the US. So there are some complications in doing it, but somehow a lot of people seem to be managing it. So recently, CBC said that 126,000 Canadians moved to the United States in 2022. And what does 126,000 mean? Well, that's up 70% from a decade ago. So yes, there are a lot of people moving, and more than they're ever used to, as the US is a more attractive place for well-off people to be.
Well, so other than 126,000 people, well, hopefully we can move that digit another 2 spots, 126,002, Melissa and Gerry Scott. So what is motivating people to move to the United States?
Well, keep in mind, there are always people moving back and forth for all sorts of reasons. And certainly the economic ones have been in the news a lot lately. But I would say that the single biggest reason that people move is romantic reasons. So someone visits one, across the border, or someone goes to school. This is very common, goes to school and says, oh, I met somebody. I really want to stay with that person for a long time. And so they have to decide where they're going to live, and somebody has to move if they're going to make that happen. So that is probably the single most common reason. On average, things tend to balance out over time. We see a trend occasionally moving in one direction or the other. So right now, it's people moving down to the US because taxes are far better, because the economic opportunities are far better. But not too long ago, in the early 2000s, same-sex marriage was legal in Canada, but not legal in the United States. So we saw a ton of same-sex couples moving from the US to Canada in order to get married. Prior to that, we saw a lot of healthcare professionals, particularly doctors and nurses, moving from Canada to the United States in the 1990s, especially as there were cutbacks, due to the federal government reducing funding to the provinces, reducing transfer payments to the provinces. So they were, putting caps on what doctors and nurses primarily could earn. And so there are a lot of doctors and nurses who are moving from Canada to the United States back in the 90s. And we are still paying for that legacy today.
And I also see with my notes here is that the tax rates in the United States, there's becoming that gap is widening between the top rate in the United States and the top rate in Canada.
Well, people move for a lot of different reasons, and tax is certainly one of them. And especially if you're at a top tax rate payer, which doesn't take much in Canada. If you're up just above $220,000 a year Canadian, then you're in the top tax bracket here, which in most provinces is typically somewhere around 53.5%. Alberta is a little bit lower, but most other provinces are still somewhere in that range. And when Canadian tax rates diverge a lot from the US rates, especially for high income people because they're most mobile, then they're incentivized to move south. In the US, compared to our 53.5, tax rates are generally, they cap out around 37%. And there's some gimmicks that can lower that to about 30%. So that's a big gap in our tax rates, about 23% for quite a number of people. And for capital gains, now that we've increased our capital gain rates, we're looking at in some states, which some states have very different tax rates. So if you're in Florida or Texas or Washington State or a few others, then you're looking at a top capital gains tax rate of about 24%. Compare that to the new Canadian capital gain rates, which typically are around 36% in most provinces. Now, remember, state taxes are different. So in Canada, most provincial taxes are roughly the same. So when I say Ontario top tax rate is 53.5, and Quebec top tax rate is 53.5, and BC is pretty darn close to that, and most provinces are pretty close to that. In the US, they're very, very different. So if you're in Florida or Texas, your top income tax rate is 37%. But if you're in California, it's over 50. So different states have very different tax rates.
Is it safe to assume that my opening comments were Canada's making it tougher to stay and tougher to leave? Is that pretty accurate?
Well, I don't know that they've made it much more difficult to leave. I mean, if you leave, there is a capital gains tax that is faced by many people. It's called the deemed disposition or departure tax. And by raising capital gain tax rates, yeah, it makes it harder to get out. But Canada is making it tougher to stay from a tax perspective by continually raising tax rates in all sorts of different ways. It wasn't that long ago that top Canadian tax rates were about 46%. And now they've gone all the way up to 53.5. That's a very large jump. And we are diverging from the United States.
What assets would be exempt from taxation on that exit tax?
So the departure tax or the deemed disposition tax is applied on, it starts with everything, and then there are a few exceptions. So the general rule is everything subject to it. But, and the way it works is when you leave, you are treated as though you sold everything you own to yourself for fair market value. So if it has some cost amount and it's gone up in value, it's like you sold it to yourself and recognized the gain. Now, we often call that a pregnant gain. Now, there are some exceptions. The first and biggest exception is Canadian real estate. So if you own Canadian real estate and you leave and you've got a deemed disposition in general, you don't have it on, say, the home that you own. But it's wider than that. It is on any real estate you directly own, not through a corporation, but anything you directly own. And the reason is when it ultimately gets sold, Canada is going to get its pound of flesh at that time. It's going to charge tax when it's sold. So they don't have to get you on the way out. But there are some other things that are exempt. And the most important ones are registered plans. So RRSPs and RIFs and similar sorts of things. There's a long list of other stuff, but they're really quite narrow exceptions. Things like, most family trusts are exempt. But you really have to speak to somebody who knows your specific affairs to be able to get a good answer on that kind of stuff. The big stuff, real estate and registered plans, those are all exempt.
Okay, so when you say real estate, are we just talking about principal residence? Or are we talking about, but a rental property would not be exempt?
A rental property is exempt. So if you own Canadian rental property, again, you have to own it directly. You can't own it through a corporation. Then it's exempt. Again, Canada's going to get its pound of flesh when you sell the property 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when you die. It's going to get its money at some point in time. So they're not worried about that. They don't have to do this on the way out. The reason they do this for the other assets is it's their one kick at the can. They're not going to get a chance to do it later on.
Okay, so all those rental properties that you would own, as long as they're not owned within a corporation, there is no exit tax. It's just when you do sell it, you're going to be subject to a capital gains.
That's right.
Okay, yeah. That's very, very interesting. But sadly, a lot of people have bought, and a lot of doctors have taken corporate money, locked all these assets into a corporation. So that's a problem.
That is a problem because now you own shares in a Canadian corporation. When you leave, the shares are subject to a deemed disposition like everything else. It doesn't matter what's inside. You've got shares of a Canadian corporation or any corporation. You are treated as though you sold those shares to yourself. Now, there's some planning you can do to deal with that in advance. Again, it's very specific planning, so you need to get an expert to help you with your specific affairs. But if you have a deemed disposition and if you have this departure tax to pay, it is possible to, instead of paying it right away, to provide security to the Canada Revenue Agency. So CRA wants to make sure that they're going to get their money. And so if you give them security when you leave, they will say, okay, you don't have to pay the tax right now. So what is security? Well, the most common security is Government of Canada bonds. You go and you buy Government of Canada bonds and you deposit them with CRA. They're still yours, but CRA is holding on to them. They still pay interest. You get the interest. But CRA gets to hold that until you've satisfied your tax liability. So that means at some point when the underlying assets are sold, you pay your tax. And if you sell them and don't pay the tax, CRA says, thank you very much. We are now yoinking the Government of Canada bonds away. Now, there are other forms of security that are okay as well. If you get a letter of credit from a Canadian bank, so the bank says, don't worry, Government of Canada, if the taxpayer doesn't pay you, we will. And usually the bank will want to make sure that you have funds on deposit or some other asset that they can lay claim to. And they will charge you a fee for that, typically between 1% and 2% a year for providing that letter of credit.
Is that structured like an estate freeze in theory? So when you leave, you exit the taxes. So let's say, for example, if it's $500,000 worth of tax that's being owed, you basically just have a $500,000 bond, Government of Canada bond with CRA. So in theory, is it triggered from that point going forward?
The trigger is when you ultimately sell the asset that was subject to the deemed disposition. So let's suppose that you had a home in Maui, like some people I know, and it had gone up in value. Say it's gone up by $2 million in value, and it generated, let's say it went up by $1.5 million, and it generated $500,000 of capital gain. Sorry, $500,000 capital gain tax when you leave. And you put that $500,000 bond in with CRA as security. When you sell the Maui home, you're going to realize that gain. You're going to have to pay tax, not on the whole gain, but just on the part that was crystallized when you left Canada. And you'll have to pay the $500,000, and then they give you back your security.
Once again, Canada is taxing you on the exit tax is based on global assets, worldwide assets.
That's right. When you leave, everything you own. I started with everything, and there are a few exceptions. So everything means stuff in Canada and stuff everywhere else. Doesn't matter whether it's in the United States or Zimbabwe.
Wow, geez, I'm getting depressed here, Kevin. That's
it's going to cost you to get out.
Oh my gosh! I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we deal with this stuff every day. There's not a lot of Canadians. We see more Americans leaving United States and being a covered expat, a non-covered expat, and coming up to Canada and dealing with all that stuff and renouncing and all these other issues that they want to go through. But boy, we don't really see a lot of Canadians, and you would probably see more Canadians on your end, I would think, leaving.
Well, when you see Americans come up to Canada, the vast majority of them keep their U.S. citizenship. And there are some complexities involved, especially on the tax side, but they are not usually too keen to give up their US citizenship because that's their ticket back if and when they need to go. And Americans, just like Canadians, tend to be emotionally attached to their country. And I don't fault them for that. You want to be able to move back if things change at some point. So just as it is rare for a Canadian moving abroad to give up Canadian citizenship, it's rare for an American moving abroad from the US, even to Canada, to give up American citizenship. Now, we actually have numbers on people who renounce US citizenship because they're published every quarter. Because when you give up US citizenship, the State Department has to, publish your name in the bad boy list. And we find that typically there's somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 Americans a year who give up US citizenship. That is not a whole lot, given that there are 330 million or so Americans. Now, the people who do it tend to be high net worth. They live abroad, but so maybe they're more important than your average American, but it's rare. In the scheme of things, it's really pretty rare. It's something we spend a fair bit of time actually doing in our practice, but that doesn't happen a lot.
Is it safe to assume that a person would come to you and you guys would basically just do that analysis on what is actually owed? You'd have an entire plan before those people actually left the country?
Yeah, so getting back to Canadians moving abroad, it's complicated. And so when people come to us and say, well, I'm thinking of moving abroad, I've met somebody, or my business is expanding, or I just want to get out because the tax rates are so high. Then we start off by asking them a whole lot of questions about their financial and other affairs and where they plan to be, because as I said, different states have different tax rates, and that has a big impact on how things happen. And they tax quite differently. So California's tax system is quite different than New York's, even though they're both high tax states. And so we ask them a whole lot of questions, and we develop a plan for them in advance so they can move consciously instead of unconsciously. Because let me tell you, I've seen a bunch of people who move, and then we say, did you realize A, B, C, and D? And they go, oops. And if you've already moved, it's generally too late to do the good planning. And you can end up with very large tax liabilities without knowing about it. And that's not just on the Canadian side. We talked about the deemed disposition. The US has a whole bunch of tricks waiting for you when you get there if you have Canadian assets. So in particular, suppose you've got Canadian corporations or partnerships or trusts, and you move to the US when you still have those things. Well, the US sees those, at least starting out, as a way to avoid or evade US tax. So there's a whole bunch of reporting that has to go on, and there's a whole bunch of characterization of that stuff that requires you to pay taxes you never knew were there. You get hit, sideways when you're not expecting it. So it's really important, if you're considering moving from Canada to the US, get help from people who know what they're doing.
Is there a threshold that you're seeing when you're seeing a lot of high net worth people going in, moving from Canada to the United States?
Well, I don't see many low-income people going, but I see people going who are of what we would think of as modest income, people earning $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 a year. Those are not wealthy people by any means, especially if they're living in a major city. But, and those people tend not to have terribly complicated affairs. And, because of my specialty, I tend to see people who are of considerably higher net worth and income moving. But people move for all sorts of reasons. We see obviously people who, are children of well-to-do parents who've gone to school in the United States, and they've decided that to maximize the value of the degree that they're getting, because it was expensive, because they paid for it, and US universities are not cheap. Colleges are not cheap. So they want to maximize their value, and maximizing value for someone in their early 20s or 30s often means going to the US. And typically they can get in because they've got a US education. Not always, but we find it's not too hard to do. Well, many of those, what we call children, they're adults, but they're still kids of families. Those people often are beneficiaries of a trust that their parents set up for them. Or those people are shareholders in their parents' corporations in Canada. And that makes life complicated and difficult. So you want to do your planning before you move into the US, particularly those situations. Those are ones where people often don't think about it. And the kids say to the parents, I'm moving down. I don't care what you've got for me back in Canada. My future is here. I'm working for a tech company in San Francisco. I'm working for a startup in New York. I like the weather down here in Arizona. And that creates a whole bunch of challenges for parents who are running companies which may have very significant US tax implications now that there's a shareholder living in the United States.
Excuse me. One thing that's kind of stuck in my mind here, you made a comment. How often do you see a person having, let's pick on Maui again. They've got a home for the last 20 years. There's a huge appreciation. And that is going to be part of the exit tax. How common is that for someone to have a 20-year relationship of just visiting one of these desirable places and then all of a sudden saying, I want to move down? Is that quite common where there's already an establishment of some sort?
Happens all the time. So what happens is you get somebody who's been reasonably successful, and then they, a Canadian who's been really reasonably successful and reaches the age of 40 or 50 and says, I'd like somewhere warm for the winters because, you're in Vancouver and, to me, that's warm. But in Toronto, in Montreal, in Ottawa, in Winnipeg, it gets cold in the winter. And so people buy homes in Arizona and Florida most commonly, and they spend time there. And typically they will spend 3, 4, 5 months a year. Not a lot, spend 6 months a year, but then they reach age, say, 60, and they say, okay, I am retiring. I've sold my business. My kids are taking over. I think I want to be in the US permanently or most of the time and come up and visit Canada. So that progression happens all the time.
Okay. And they have to have some kind of business interest in order to be able to move down there. And I mean, we're talking about tax, but now we have to talk about immigration a little bit here too.
Sure. So Canadians are allowed to be in the US for up to 6 months a year for immigration purposes. So the law is very different for tax purposes. Immigration purposes, you're allowed to be there up to 6 months a year. But, and this is the weird part, because I'm a tax guy, not an immigration guy, but for immigration purposes, when they're counting days in the US, if you flip back and forth between Canada and the US quickly, some of those days where you're physically in Canada can be counted as though you are in the US for US immigration law. So I find people occasionally who think that they're fine because they haven't spent 6 months a year in the United States. But the immigration people tell them, oh yeah, but we count those Canadian days as US days. And it's really weird and strange when that happens. And I'm not an expert on when that happens, but it's important to know it can happen. So you can overstay your 6 months if you're not careful.
So you're talking about the I-94 and that coming back, like you say, going home, and they can still see that as being the original entry point of that I-94. Who cares if you're going back and forth? We're still saying, is that what you're talking about from the time they issued the I-94?
So the I-94 is important, but counting the number of days from an immigration perspective is different than counting a number of days from a tax perspective. So there are things you have to be careful about filing from a tax perspective, but immigration is different, and the consequences are quite a lot different. So if you're fiddling with that 6 month threshold, you need immigration advice and tax advice.
Yeah, exactly. Now I heard we were talking to a fellow out of Seattle, and we came across this accidental American situation. And we did find out that the son of this American was not an accidental American because the father had moved from the time he was born in the United States. I think he moved over to Canada when he was 6 months old. So there was no issues whatsoever in this situation. But we constantly hear, we've created that app, the Snowbird US State Tracker. We're hearing all these people saying there's a 12-month rolling calendar. And we keep on saying for the average snowbird, it doesn't really exist. But the immigration lawyer that I was talking to really laid it out very clear. He said, listen, there's a border there for a reason. The immigration guys, the border crossing agents are telling you they don't have to let you into this country. The border is there for a reason. So you tell me why you believe that you deserve to be in this country. And that's why they say it. They can deny it. They have discretion. And it might not be right. And sometimes they talk about all kinds of rules we didn't know existed, but they have discretion. They can keep people out for the safety of American people. So I get that part. Okay, Kevin, so let's move on to what about Americans moving to Canada?
So Americans moving to Canada, they have an especially complicated scenario, because when an American moves to Canada, they cease to live in the US, but typically they're US citizens. Sometimes they're green card holders. That's rare, but usually they are US citizens. Well, if you're a US citizen or you have a green card, you are subject to US tax on your worldwide income, no matter where you live. And so we have people who are born US citizens in Canada, never set foot into the United States. And we tell them, and they're surprised, that they have to file a US tax return report, all their Canadian income to the IRS. And they go, that's crazy. I've never been to the United States. And I said, but you have a US passport. Yeah, but I got that at the local consulate. I've never been to the United States. I just happen to be a citizen because my mom was American. I said, guess what? You're American and you are subject to US tax on your worldwide income, and you have to file a US tax return. And by the way, all these things you have in Canada, mutual funds and corporations and partnerships and trusts, boy, there's lots of US reporting that has to be done for that. And it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to do that. Isn't that fun? So these people who are typically, as you referred to them, called accidental Americans, and sometimes, they're accidental Americans are people who moved up here when they were babies or young children. People who didn't know they were American until someone tells them, by the way, you're American, and by the way, you have tax liabilities. Now, not necessarily financial liabilities, but a liability to file. You must file a tax return. And very often, the filing of the tax return is way more expensive than any tax they may owe. In fact, that is the most common scenario, that the cost of the return is higher than the tax that they owe. The tax they owe tends to be nominal.
We came across this situation today on a call. This family is Americans. They get moved up here on a great job, and they're going to be up in Canada for the 60 months. So they have a little bit of an exemption if they sell any of the assets. It's not considered to be worldwide income from a Canadian perspective if they exit within 6 months. But all of a sudden, this issue comes up that they, on the call today, the wife says, oh, by the way, I'm involved with a family LLC. It's a bunch of real estate. My parents are getting older. What tax implications and what should I worry about? It almost got to the point where she was considering moving from Vancouver to Bellingham and allowing her husband. What can a person do in that situation? So the mom and dad haven't sold any assets. There's been no distributions from the LLC, but there must be a huge tax liability there.
So earlier on in this discussion, we talked about the complications of children of Canadians moving to the United States and still being shareholders or beneficiaries of trusts that are in Canada. Well, this is the reverse problem. So this is a child who is American, moves up to Canada, and is still a member of a US entity like an LLC, because they're very common, and therefore has an interest in US assets while still being a resident of Canada. And similarly, so this is just the mirror image, and it's really complex and can give rise to significant double taxation if you're not careful, sometimes even if you are careful. So LLCs are a weird animal because they literally don't exist in Canada. There is no such thing as a Canadian LLC, which for your viewers is a limited liability company. It is a corporate animal that does not exist in Canada. And so Canada, for tax purposes, says, we're going to call that a corporation, just because. And not always, because there are exceptions. Mostly it's a corporation, but it's a foreign corporation. And the US says, in most cases, again, not always, we treat it like a partnership. So we're going to tax you on the income earned by the LLC, even though you never got it. So that's the kind of stuff that requires individualized advice and expertise. Again, as you said at the beginning, don't try this at home.
I'm pulling a Donald Trump here. I'm kind of going off script here, but I got to tell you, and we're seeing this quite often on the wealth management side. We're seeing these irrevocable trusts established in the States. They're easy to do, and it makes sense. There's no probate, but there's still estate tax on those trusts. But now you've got the trustee moves up to Canada, becomes a Canadian resident, and all of a sudden, Wells Fargo is calling us up saying, well, guess what? We can't manage these assets. You're going to have to look after it. And we keep on telling people that you got to be careful because it becomes a Canadian trust.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is commonly known as a living trust. And they largely exist as a mechanism to avoid probate. Sometimes they're helpful in estate tax, but mostly it's a probate thing. It's easier to transfer assets to your heirs, mostly your kids, with a living trust. They are very valuable to someone in the United States. As soon as you move up to Canada, that just adds tremendous complications. And the problem is if you keep them in place for a long time, they can be very difficult and expensive to unwind. So if you've got that and you're moving to Canada, and remember, these generally apply to older people because you don't usually establish a living trust if you're 30.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of them for people who decide they're going to retire at age, 60, 70, up to Canada. And they come in and they say, oh, yeah, I have this living trust. It's been in place for 30 years. And now what do I do? Well, if you've been in Canada for 20 years while it's been in place, you may have some trouble. And as you say, some of the US money managers, when they recognize that the trust is now administered in Canada, has become a Canadian trust, they can't advise, they can't transact anything, and they have to wash their hands of the client.
There was a suggestion that Wells Fargo said to the client, listen, you can appoint us as a co-director, and we will provide director services or trustee services on this. And there's a way that we can work around it. But I didn't really believe that could happen because you're still dealing with this Canadian resident who actually has sole, power over the trust, the direction of the assets and the whole works. And the beneficiaries are still living in the United States. And sometimes
the kids are still there. Yeah.
The kids are still, I get worried because I think this cross-border space has exploded over the last 10, 15 years or so. And then you got people like yourself. And some of these other accountants that we're dealing with that are called cross-border accountants, it kind of worries me that, and I never want to step in and be the accountant and give advice, but by no means, I would never do it. But I do get worried for the clients that these people are getting the right advice from their existing accountant. And it's sad because it's the accountant that referred the people to us.
Yeah. As with any profession, or any endeavor, there are people who are more skilled and less skilled. And unfortunately, there are people who hold themselves out to be cross-border accountants or lawyers or financial advisors who don't really have the expertise necessary to deal with people at certain levels. Now, remember, there are also clients who require various levels of expertise because some of them have just pretty simple stuff and some of them have really complex stuff. And being able to separate the wheat from the chaff is part of the job of the professional. And that applies to you in your practice and me in my practice and the accountants in their practices. And, the trick is find someone by word of mouth because that's the only way you're going to get referral to someone who really knows what he or she is talking about. There are now a number of professionals doing this who are pretty good at it. I've been in this cross-border business longer than just about anybody. I started doing it in 1987. And so I think I know a lot, but there are lots of other people in the intervening years who have come up and learned quite a bit as well. So, if you want to know who's good, ask someone who's on the periphery. You know a lot of accountants and lawyers, and you'll know who's good. So your clients or the people watching this can call you and say, who should I use as an accountant or a lawyer to get my stuff done, whether it's tax returns or tax advice or structuring or moving. There are people who have varying levels of expertise. And, not everybody is an appropriate client for me. I tend to deal with high net worth clients who have complicated affairs. and I'm priced accordingly. And that means I'm not appropriate for everybody, but there are people out there who are appropriate for just about every level of expertise. And I'm going to caveat that one way. Both Canada and the United States, the IRS and CRA, have been instituting reporting rules and other kinds of rules that make things way more complicated for people who typically are of average means. And that means that if you have ordinary things going on, it may be very expensive or complicated to properly deal with them from a tax perspective. And I'll give you a very simple situation. If you have mutual funds in Canada outside of an RSP or a RIF, and you are a US citizen, there is special reporting that has to be done with your US tax return and outside your US tax return to report that account to the IRS. And that proper reporting can be very complicated and expensive because those mutual funds are what the US calls passive foreign investment companies. And a passive foreign investment company characterization reporting is very complex and very expensive. Well, if you've got, say $100,000 inside remember, this is a non-RSP RIF. This is just a regular account, regular financial account. If you've got a mutual fund in that, which millions of Canadians have, well, if you're a US citizen, you've got expensive reporting to do. And if you've got $100,000 there, you're probably not a rich person, but it's going to cost you quite a bit of time, effort, money, and aggravation to deal with that. So unfortunately, there are situations where it's just too darn expensive to deal with the problem properly. And I don't have a good answer for that because the IRS and CRA has equivalent things. The IRS and CRA haven't got a good answer for that. So one of the most recent things CRA is doing is CRA is requiring trusts to report, more trusts to file T3s than ever used to file before. And one of the recent things that just came up is there are a lot of things called bare trusts, where the trust doesn't really have any power. The trust actually acts as an agent for the person who is what we call the principal in the transaction. These never used to have to be reported, and we didn't care because the trust didn't earn any money. Only the principal earned the money. And so now CRA wants more filing. Tons of people are going to miss that filing because there's nothing to report. It's all information reporting. There's no income.
It's going to lead me to my next question here. And my next thought here is that we see a lot of this, and we're seeing Canadian advisors, as charming, as intelligent as they are, they don't understand these mutual funds and this PFIC. And all they're telling people is that we have a QE app, don't worry about it, we'll do all the reporting for you. But the 8621s are very, very expensive to file. So why do it? Why avoid it? So my question is that we get called in to clean up a mess. And because Raymond James purchased Gopal McDermott in 2001, the reporting that Raymond James has to do because of the US entity is a lot more than what the banks do. So we've seen problems when people moved over tax-free savings accounts. All of a sudden now there's capital gains that are actually owed on on an assessment that's done by the IRS for some older people. Now, my question is that I know we're seeing a lot of this because we're called in to clean things up. And you say, yes, there's a lot of great planning to do. And I know your new position is allowing you to do more planning more than anything. How often are you getting called in to clean up the messes?
That, unfortunately, is a fair bit of the work that I do. So someone has, done something, or very often not done something because they've just put their head in the sand. And now something has happened that requires this to be fixed. So, for instance, there is a business is going to be sold, or somebody gets sick and is about to die or has died. And many things just were ignored while they were alive or while they were cogent. And now someone else is taking over responsibility for their affairs, and that new person who has power of attorney or the executor says, I don't know if this stuff is right. Looks like mom or dad never dealt with this. Or it could be a professional executor, because we get called in by banks and trust companies on a regular basis. And they say, we think stuff needs to be done that hasn't been done. And of course, you don't want to be responsible for it as the executor or as the power of attorney, because then it becomes your problem. So I remember a Midas commercial from many, many years back that was suggesting that people fix their mufflers early. And their tagline was, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And the idea was, if you pay me later, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And that's true. So maintaining your affairs correctly while you're ongoing is so much more effective and way cheaper than waiting until it's a pile of goo at the end.
I have to say that, the early days of entering the cross-border space was almost 10 years ago now. It takes a long time to learn this and have the opportunity to speak with people like yourself, because there is a lot of people out there that it's reckless, it's scary, and I believe that these advisors are trying to do the right thing for their clients, but I think there's an ego that gets involved here, and they're doing more damage than good. So, Kevin, I really appreciate your time today, and I'll tell you something. We got to pick up on top of the podcast. We always do a webinar, and we try and reach the audience we've created with the Snowbird US Day Tracker. And once again, that's a very affluent market with people that have homes on both sides of the border, and they have no idea the problems that are going to be created for their children and sorting these things out when they become angels. So, Kevin, I really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to doing a seminar. I guess they're called webinars now with Zoom, so we look forward to it. And when I'm in Toronto, I know that, like I say, I've enjoyed your readings over the years. I know that you and I have never met in person, so I really appreciate this opportunity today and pick your brain, and thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Nice to meet you, Gerry.
Yeah, and I end every podcast, the world is small and be kind to all. So, Kevin, I thank you kindly.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Gerry.